All right, welcome everyone. This explainer is an AI-generated summary of Dr. John B. West's incredible lecture on how the lungs handle stress. Now, if you're in pulmonary or critical care, you know his textbook. It's basically foundational for generations of us. Dr. West also recorded a complete lecture series, and trust me, it's absolutely worth watching. We've got the link for you in the description below. And hey, while you're here, feel free to check out other summaries of his work on the channel.
You know, it's easy to forget just how massive the lungs' interface with the outside world is. We're talking about a blood-gas barrier that's somewhere between 50 and 100 square meters. That's huge. So today, what we're going to do is explore how this incredible system adapts and, frankly, survives when we push it to its absolute limits under four very different, very extreme types of physiological stress.
So let's start with exercise. It is, without a doubt, a massive physiological stressor. Think about it. It forces this incredible jump in your metabolic rate. And what does that mean for your lungs? Well, it means the respiratory system has to go into overdrive to do its main job, suck in oxygen and blow off CO2.
And the sheer scale of this response is just mind-boggling. Look at the numbers. When you're just sitting there, you're using maybe 300 milliliters of oxygen a minute. But during a really tough workout, that can jump 10 times to 3 liters a minute. And if you're an elite athlete, we're talking 6 liters a minute. That's a 20-fold increase. It just goes to show you the unbelievable reserve capacity that's built right into our lungs.
Okay, so let's dig into the actual data from Exercise Phys. What we're looking at here is a classic graph. On the vertical axis, you've got oxygen consumption. That's our V.O2. And on the horizontal axis is work rate. See how the red line starts off nice and linear? As you work harder, you use more oxygen. It's a one-to-one thing. But then you see it start to flatten out. It hits this plateau. That right there is your VO2 max. It's the absolute ceiling for your aerobic engine. If you want to push any harder than that, you've got to switch over to anaerobic glycolysis, which, as we know, isn't nearly as efficient.
Now, this next graph is where things get really, really interesting. This shows us what's happening to our breathing, our ventilation. So the blue line is our oxygen consumption, just like before. The orange line is ventilation. At first, they're basically moving together. But then, look at this. There's an inflection point where that orange line just takes off. It gets way steeper. That's what we call the ventilatory threshold. And what's happening there? Well, that's the exact moment your anaerobic metabolism is really kicking in, and lactate starts building up in the blood. Your peripheral chemoreceptors sense this new metabolic acidosis, and they scream at your brain to breathe faster and deeper to blow off that CO2 and buffer the acid. It's a beautiful compensatory mechanism.
So this brings up a really important question. Why does ventilation have to ramp up so much more than cardiac output? I mean, they're both delivering oxygen, right? Well, it all comes down to efficiency. Let's look at perfusion on the left. The circulatory system gets more efficient. Your muscles, when they're working hard, get really good at extracting oxygen from the blood. So the arteriovenous O2 difference gets wider. You're basically getting more bang for your buck with every liter of blood pumped. Now look at ventilation on the right. The respiratory system, well, it doesn't really have that trick up its sleeve. The body works really hard to keep arterial PO2 stable, so the difference between the oxygen you breathe in and the oxygen you breathe out stays pretty constant. So what's the only way to get more oxygen into the system? You just have to move more air, a lot more air. That's why ventilation has to increase so dramatically.
All right, so we've looked at the internal stress of exercise. Now let's completely switch gears and look at an external stress, high altitude. The problem here is completely different. It's not about your body demanding more oxygen, it's about the environment offering less. This is the world of hypobaric hypoxia.
And this graph really cuts to the heart of the problem. A lot of people think there's less oxygen at high altitude, but that's not quite right. The percentage of oxygen in the air stays the same, 20.9%, whether you're at the beach or on top of Everest. The real problem, the killer, is the drop in barometric pressure. At sea level, it's 760 millimeters of mercury. On the summit of Everest, it just craters to around 250. And thanks to Dalton's law, that means the partial pressure of the oxygen you're trying to breathe in, your PO2, plummets from a healthy 150 at sea level to a frankly terrifying 43 on the summit.
And this right here, this is a beautiful illustration of why hyperventilation is literally a matter of life and death on a mountain like Everest. Just run the alveolar gas equation. If you were magically transported to the summit and kept breathing normally, with a PCO2 of 40, your alveolar PO2 would calculate out to -7. I mean, that's not just unsurvivable, it's a physical impossibility. So what can a climber do? The only lever they can pull is their PCO2. By hyperventilating like crazy, we're talking a 5-fold increase, they can drive their PCO2 all the way down to around 8. And by doing that, they can claw their way up to a survivable, though still incredibly low alveolar PO2 of about 33.
But sometimes this adaptation process goes terribly wrong, and that brings us to HAPE, or high-altitude pulmonary edema. It's a fascinating and deadly piece of physiopathology. It all starts with the systemic hypoxia, which triggers hypoxic pulmonary vasoconstriction. The blood vessels in the lungs clamp down. But here's the crucial part. It doesn't happen evenly. It's patchy. So you get this situation where some capillary beds are constricted and protected, but others are left wide open. All that rising pulmonary artery pressure gets funneled into those few unprotected vessels. They just get blasted with pressure, leading to endothelial damage, they start to leak, and suddenly your alveoli are filling up with plasma and red blood cells.
So that's the acute adaptation. But over the long term, the body has another amazing trick: polycythemia. Just take a look at this data from people native to the Andes, living at about 4,600 meters. Their arterial PO2 is a shockingly low 45, and their O2 sat is only 81%. You'd think they'd be in serious trouble. But look at their hemoglobin. It's almost 20. It's this massive EPO-driven response to make more red blood cells. And because of that, their total arterial oxygen content is actually higher than ours is at sea level. It's just a stunning example of how the body can compensate over generations.
Okay, we've been up in the thin air of the mountains. Now let's take a deep breath and plunge into the exact opposite environment, the hyperbaric world of diving. Here, the problem isn't too little pressure, it's way, way too much. We're adding another whole atmosphere of pressure for every 10 meters we go down.
So what's the big deal with all that pressure? Well, it really all boils down to a simple piece of physics called Henry's law. Basically, the higher the pressure of a gas, the more of it will dissolve into a liquid. And in this case, the gas is nitrogen from the air we're breathing, and the liquid is, well, us, our body tissues. As a diver goes deeper, that immense pressure forces more and more nitrogen to dissolve into the body. And that's what sets the stage for all the problems that can happen when you try to come back up.
And this brings us to the most famous diving-related problem of all, decompression sickness, or as everyone calls it, the bends. Think of it like a can of soda. When it's sealed, all that CO2 is dissolved under pressure. Pop the top, the pressure drops, and you get bubbles. That's exactly what happens in a diver's body if they come up too fast. All that nitrogen that was dissolved in their tissues, especially fatty tissues like in the nervous system, suddenly comes out of solution and forms bubbles. These bubbles can block blood flow, causing everything from agonizing joint pain to catastrophic brain and spinal cord injuries. The fix, both to prevent it and treat it, is all about controlling that pressure. You either come up slowly in stages to let the nitrogen off-gas gently through the lungs, or, if it's too late, you put the diver back under pressure in a hyperbaric chamber, which literally squishes those bubbles back into solution so they can be eliminated safely.
But the bends aren't the only danger down there. A few other things can get you. First, there's inert gas narcosis. At depth, the high partial pressure of nitrogen actually starts to act like an anesthetic. It messes with your head, impairs your judgment, not something you want when you're 100 feet down. Second, the air you're breathing is incredibly dense, which makes the work of breathing just exhausting. This can lead to CO2 retention. And finally, something we don't often think about, oxygen itself can become toxic. At the really high pressure seen in diving, it can cause central nervous system toxicity, leading to seizures. And it's important to remember, this is a totally different beast from the pulmonary oxygen toxicity we worry about in the ICU. That's more of a slow burn from prolonged exposure to high FiO2 that directly damages the lung tissue.
Okay, for our last stressor, we're going to do something pretty wild. We're going to take away a force that has shaped every aspect of our physiology, a force we never even think about, gravity. Spaceflight gives us this incredible, unique laboratory to figure out just how much that constant 1G pull influences how our lungs are built and how they work right here on Earth.
Think about it. Here on Earth, your lung is constantly sagging under its own weight. Gravity is always pulling it down, and this creates some really significant differences from top to bottom. For one, blood flow is way higher at the bases than at the apices. This is the source of our classic VVQ mismatch, but it's also a mechanical thing. Gravity stretches the alveoli at the top, making them bigger than the ones at the bottom. And this might be the reason why diseases like emphysema and spontaneous pneumothorax love to happen at the lung apices. They're under the most constant stress.
Okay, now check out this data from the Space Lab missions. It is just fantastic. What you're seeing is the lung's diffusing capacity over time. You have the baseline before the flight, then boom, the instant the astronauts get into microgravity, their diffusing capacity shoots up and it stays up for the whole mission. So what's going on? It's a massive fluid shift. All that blood that gravity normally pulls down into your legs suddenly shifts upward into your chest. This engorges the pulmonary capillaries, recruiting the entire capillary bed and basically maximizing the surface area available for gas exchange. It's an incredible demonstration.
So, let's just wrap up what we learned from space. In microgravity, blood flow and ventilation get much more even. Your central blood volume goes up, and so does your cardiac output. Your lung volumes actually shift around a bit. But here's the kicker, the most amazing finding of all. Despite all these huge, dramatic changes, the lung's primary job, gas exchange, is basically perfect. Alveolar PO2 and PCO2 don't change. It turns out the lung works incredibly well without gravity.
And that brings us to the end. Thank you so much for your time. I really hope you found this useful. Medicine is just filled with these long-standing assumptions, and real progress only starts when we begin to question them. So treat every source, including this one, with a healthy dose of skepticism. And please, take the time to go back and review Dr. West's book on respiratory physiology. It's a classic for a reason.